Have you ever stopped mid-sentence and thought about what you just said? Like, really thought about it? You're giving someone advice, something practical and helpful, and you say, well, as a rule of thumb? And then, if you're paying attention, you pause. Rule of thumb. Thumb. Your thumb. The one on your hand right now? What does that have to do with anything? It doesn't sound like a rule. It doesn't feel like a measurement. And yet, somehow, everyone knows exactly what it means. Nobody's confused. Nobody's staring at their hand. We just accept it. That right there is the quiet magic and occasional madness of language. In this episode, we're pulling that phrase apart to see what's actually inside. Welcome back to the lost history of everyday things. Please hit the like and subscribe buttons. Here's the honest truth before we even begin. Rule of thumb is one of those phrases that, the more you examine it, the less sense it makes on its surface. There's no logical reason why your thumb should be the universal ambassador for general guidelines. If someone handed you a phrase today, something brand new, and said, use this whenever you mean a rough general principle, and they suggested rule of thumb, you'd probably laugh at them. You'd say, what does a thumb have to do with principles? Why not rule of gut, or rule of instinct, or rule of experience? But here's the thing. The thumb actually did have everything to do with it. At least, once upon a time, it was the most practical measuring tool a person could carry. And they carried it everywhere because it was literally attached to their hand. Let's go back, way back. Before standardized measurements, before rulers and tape measures and inches or millimeters, the world ran on the human body. People measured things with their feet, their arms, their hands, and yes, their thumbs. An inch, as a unit, was widely associated with the width of a grown man's thumb. Not officially, not always precisely, but practically. If you needed to know roughly how wide something was, you pressed your thumb against it and counted. 1 thumb, 2 thumbs, 3 thumbs. That's how a carpenter worked. That's how a tailor measured fabric. That's how a farmer built a fence post hole. It was imprecise by modern standards, obviously. Your thumb is not my thumb. A narrow thumb and a wide thumb are going to produce very different results. But the principle was sound enough for everyday life. Good enough for the task at hand, so to speak. The phrase rule of thumb began appearing in English texts in the 17th century. One of the earliest recorded uses was by the Scottish preacher James Durham around 1685, who used it to describe practical knowledge as opposed to formal or theoretical knowledge. It was a way of distinguishing between things you learn from books and things you learn from doing. A rule of thumb wasn't a law. It wasn't something you derived mathematically. It was something you figured out through experience, through repetition, through pressing your actual thumb against the world and seeing what happened. Craftsmen especially lived by this kind of knowledge. A blacksmith didn't need a thermometer to know when iron was hot enough to work. He could judge by the color of the metal. A brewer didn't need precise chemistry to know when fermentation was complete. He could taste it, smell it, feel the temperature of the barrel. A baker didn't need a timer. She pressed her thumb into the dough and knew from the resistance whether it had risen enough. The thumb wasn't just a measurement. It was a stand-in for the whole body of accumulated wisdom that skilled workers carried in their hands and their senses. The rule of thumb was the rule of experience. Over time, as formal education and standardized systems expanded, the phrase evolved. It drifted away from its literal origins and became metaphorical. Instead of meaning specifically something you measure with your thumb, it came to mean any general principle that works well enough in practice, even if it isn't perfectly precise. A rule of thumb for saving money. A rule of thumb for estimating travel time. A rule of thumb for how much pasta to cook per person, which, if you've ever made pasta for a dinner party, you know we could all use a better one. Now, it's worth mentioning something because it tends to come up whenever people start researching this phrase. There's a persistent and rather grim theory that the rule of thumb once referred to a law allowing a man to beat his wife with a stick, so long as the stick was no wider than his thumb. You may have heard this. It circulates in casual history discussions and sometimes shows up in newspaper articles as if it were established fact. However, historians and legal scholars have found no evidence that such a law ever existed in either English or American legal history. The phrase appears in legal texts, sure, but not in the context of that particular rule. The origin of this claim seems to trace back to a misreading or misattribution, and it has been thoroughly questioned by serious researchers. It's a compelling story, which is probably why it persists. But compelling stories and accurate history are not always the same thing. The far more likely and more boring truth is that the phrase is simply about thumb as ruler and nothing darker. What's genuinely fascinating is how different languages around the world have their own versions of this idea. German speakers use the phrase Pi mal Daumen, which roughly translates to pi times thumb, meaning a rough circular estimate. It captures the same idea. You're approximating, using your body, using what's at hand, getting close enough. Dutch has op de vuist, with your fist. Many cultures independently arrived at the same conclusion that the human body, and the hand in particular, is the original measuring instrument. Before rulers, before scales, before calibration, there was the thumb. And in a way, that's a beautiful thing. It means that humans, across centuries and continents, solved the same problem the same way. We needed a reliable enough shortcut, and we used ourselves. We are the measure of things, in the oldest and most practical sense. The phrase also survived because it filled a specific gap in language that no other phrase quite filled. Approximately is too formal. Roughly is a bit vague on its own. In my experience, is too personal. Rule of thumb carries all of those meanings at once. It says, this is not exact, but it's good enough, and it comes from somewhere real. It's the linguistic equivalent of a well-worn tool. It's not pretty, it's not calibrated, but it works. And here's where we come to the confession buried at the heart of this phrase. If you hear rule of thumb for the first time, there's genuinely no way you would figure out what it means from the words alone. None. It is not intuitive. If you asked a child what a rule of thumb was, they would stare at you and then probably try to make some kind of rule using their actual thumb. Which, fair enough. The thumb is right there. And yet the phrase sticks. It has stuck for centuries. People who have never touched a measuring stick or pressed a thumb to a piece of cloth still use it effortlessly. It has outlived the literal practice that gave it meaning. The thumb measurement is gone. The phrase remains. And somehow, despite making very little obvious logical sense, it remains the perfect shortcut for an idea that would otherwise take an entire sentence to explain. That is the peculiar staying power of idiomatic language. It doesn't need to make surface-level sense. It needs to feel right. It needs to carry meaning efficiently. And sometimes it needs to sound just specific enough to give the listener pause, just memorable enough to stick in the mind. A rule of thumb is odd enough that you notice it the first time you really hear it. And once you've heard it that way, once you've asked yourself why on earth a thumb is involved, the meaning is somehow more memorable, not less. The strangeness is the hook. So, next time you find yourself telling someone that as a rule of thumb, they should keep 3 months of expenses in savings, or as a rule of thumb, they should leave 15 minutes early, or as a rule of thumb, they should measure a cup of dry pasta per person and absolutely ignore that advice. If they're feeding anyone who likes food, you'll know exactly where that phrase has been. It traveled from the hands of medieval craftsmen through centuries of practical knowledge, past a few bad historical rumors, and arrived here, still carrying the ghost of a thumb pressed against a piece of wood or cloth or bread dough. Close enough, good enough, and entirely its own. The shortest tools often have the longest histories, and the most useful rules rarely need to be perfect. They just need to work. Thank you for watching this episode. If you have thoughts or suggestions for upcoming videos, please share them in the comments section. Thank you for being a part of this episode exploring the lost history of everyday things. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep an eye out for future episodes exploring the history that mystifies us when we stop to think about it.